Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams about various Christian topics centered around the Holy Spirit. And the current topic is called Spiritual Realities. And this is episode 3. Let's go ahead and get started. So the title of part 3 is Consciousness, Our Window into Reality. So today we're going to be talking about consciousness. Now, thus far in the series, we've explored the limited amount of information that is in the Bible about the spiritual realm, and even more limited information in the Bible about the afterlife and what to expect. There's, of course, lots of information about how to get to the afterlife, which I would argue is one of the main purposes of the Bible, but not a lot of information about exactly what that will entail. Now, we've also examined the many types of paranormal experiences that have been reported consistently throughout history and what they might mean or might imply about spiritual reality. But many of us have never had such paranormal experiences and perhaps don't even believe in them at all, or perhaps you think that they are all demonic, and maybe that's true. So today we are going to examine something that we all share, and that is consciousness. Every waking moment of our lives is experienced through the lens of consciousness. Yet we still don't precisely know what it is or even why it exists. Could the mystery of consciousness itself reveal something into the profound nature of what true reality is? Well, there are actually a lot of scriptures about consciousness, or what could be taken as consciousness, but here are two of my favorites. Ecclesiastes 3:11, He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, though men cannot fathom it. Then they have Job 32, verse 8, that says, There is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. The Bible doesn't explain consciousness. In fact, it's very happy leaving it a big mystery, but it does suggest something remarkable, that God has placed within us an awareness that reaches beyond the physical realm. So the first slide is consciousness is stranger than we realize. I would say most of us on a day-to-day basis don't think much about consciousness. It's just something that we have. But it is an important topic, and there are lots of things we can learn from it. So that is why it is the topic of today's episode. So what is consciousness? It is more than intelligence. It is more than information processing and mere storage, I would say. So when we hear the word consciousness, we often think of intelligence, but they are definitely not the same thing. A calculator and a computer, those are both very intelligent in a very narrow sense. And then you can think of modern AI, artificial intelligence, and it can perform tasks, many of which surpass human ability, or certainly pass time it takes for a human to do something. Yet none of those systems necessarily have what I would call an inner experience. Intelligence is about solving problems, but consciousness is about experiencing them. Consciousness is definitely more than just information processing or storage, although I would say both of those facets are required for consciousness. Every computer processes information, even simple things like your thermostat in your home process information. Even a plant, sitting there on your desk responds to the information in its environment, but processing information doesn't explain why there should be an inner experience associated with it. Computer can calculate the RGB values for the color red, but does it know what red is or what it is to experience the color red? Only a conscious being actually experiences that type of sensory input, like what is redness. And it's more than memory or the storage of information or the storage of past experiences. You can remember events while unconscious through like a security camera or a computer log. You can look at a video of yourself or something from the past and you can remind yourself, well, that's where I was. Or you can look at the infinite number of photos that we take nowadays on our phone of, let's say, a past vacation that you took. But that is not the experience itself. It only helps to remind you of the experience. And likewise, during anesthesia, memories stop forming, but that's not because consciousness itself goes away forever. Consciousness seems to be put on pause, and then it comes back. So I want to talk a little bit about this term subjective experience. It kept coming up as I was researching this topic, and so it's very important. I guess you could say it's a philosophical term or even a scientific term, but a subjective experience is the term I would say most used by philosophers to define consciousness, and it is the personal and individual emotional and cognitive impact of an event which cannot be objectively measured or fully understood by others. So you can imagine you have two people watching or experiencing the same event, and yet they will both go away with different experiences. And that is this idea of that's the subjectiveness of experiences. Think about how you don't merely detect light frequencies or electromagnetic frequencies coming into your eye. Instead, you experience color. You don't merely detect air pressure waves coming into your ears. Instead, you hear language and you hear music. And you don't just merely process pain. You don't just say, my leg was just cut off. That's not good. Instead, you actually feel and experience the agony. Then there's this idea of being yourself or being me. Every one of us knows exactly what consciousness is because it is every moment that we're awake. And yet it's nearly impossible to describe. I would say it's the undeniable sense that there is someone behind your eyes experiencing the world. There is a me having those experiences. Some of it has to do with just the continuous nature of consciousness, but I think we've all had sort of that feeling of being in the back seat of our mind as experiences unfurl before us. Science has become remarkably good at explaining what the brain does and how it does it. Explaining why any of those experiences should be accompanied by a subjective experience or an inner experience remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in science, or in humanity, I would say. For instance, imagine that you could build an exact atom for atom copy of your brain and have it kind of sit next to you. Would that thing, which is an exact replica of your brain, would it have an inner life? Would it now be another you? Or would it just simply behave like a machine or behave like it has consciousness? And there's this mystery, the mystery of consciousness. Why is there an inner experience at all? We can describe what the brain does electrically and chemically. We can even take medications or come up with pharmaceuticals that change the way we experience reality, but that doesn't explain why those processes should be accompanied by an inner experience. Why isn't everything happening in the dark, without anyone experiencing it? Why isn't the brain just an unconscious computer? The brain processes information just like a computer does, but a computer, doesn't appear to have an inner life. So why should billions of neurons suddenly produce the feeling of seeing, hearing, loving, or fearing, these experiences? And how does just this matter? If you think about the molecules, you think about the proteins and the electrical impulses, how does matter become awareness? Or how does awareness emerge from the cellular matter of your brain? Every atom in your brain, every cell in your brain, every neuron alone is not conscious. And yet when you connect them together, then suddenly you have this personal experience. The awareness of the ego or I am. Where does that come from? How does it emerge? And science has no accepted answer. Neuroscience has made, incredible progress in understanding how the brain works when it comes to explaining consciousness or why consciousness exists in the first place, there is no widely accepted explanation. It really is one of the deepest mysteries in science and philosophy. Now, that alone doesn't prove the existence of a spirit within the body, but it does mean that anyone claiming that consciousness is just the brain and the chemistry and the complexity of neurons being connected, anyone who says that flippantly is not talking about settled science. What consciousness reveals. We experience a reality from the inside, because that's kind of how it feels. It feels like I'm looking outward into reality. Our consciousness cannot be directly observed from others. We think that everybody else in the world is experiencing things the same way we do, and yet that may or may not be true. I've heard of many stories where someone learns about something that is specific to them, and they learn about it very late in life, as a teenager or even as an adult. There's something called anaphasia, which is that some people lack the ability to visualize pictures in their mind. And someone who has that doesn't know that everyone else doesn't have that most people do have the ability to imagine some image or picture in their mind. So that's just an example of how our consciousness can differ without us knowing. I would say that every worldview that's out there, it has to try to account for consciousness. It has to account for, if you think about governments, it has to account for the capability of its citizens to experience the world. And depending on what it comes up with, you will come up with different types of worldviews and different types of government systems. I would say that is why this is a really important episode. It's our only window into the physical reality, but I think it's also our best window into reality, the full reality, which I believe includes, or is most importantly, a spiritual reality, inside of which is our physical reality. So what can consciousness reveal? I did talk a little bit about anesthesia. Anesthesia is a very interesting topic. I think, well, I can't say all of us, but many of us have gone under the knife, as they say it. During anesthesia, the brain's normal conscious processing is disrupted. You think about it, if you have undergone general anesthesia, we all have slept at night and we've had dreams. Some of us have very vivid dreams, but under anesthesia, it's very different. It's a really high percentage. It's like over 99% of people have no dreaming, have no awareness, have no concept of the passage of time. It's as though conscious experience is simply just absent. Most of the brain has been shown to operate, though, while you're under general anesthesia. There have been all kinds of tests where they put people into an fMRI machine, which shows where things are happening within the brain. And it's, in some ways, it can be difficult to tell if you've had the fMRI image of someone who's conscious versus someone who's under anesthesia. They look actually very similar. So what is different about being under anesthesia and unconscious than when you are conscious? And it seems to be that the different parts of the brain are not connected anymore. And that is what removes consciousness, but not permanently, fortunately, for us. Time and experience disappear. One moment you're talking with the anesthesiologist and maybe he's told you to count down. I know I have tried. There are various times that I've been put under, I'm going to make it to 1. He says count down from 10. I'm going to make it to 1. 10, 9, and that's it. You're out. And then the next moment you're waking up in recovery. And I have even tried to, wake up as fast as possible. I don't want to be groggy. I don't want to appear vulnerable or something. I don't know what it is, but I try to, in the beginning, it's sort of faking, and I'm sure the nurses can tell. In the beginning, I'm sort of faking that I am conscious. I'm only partially conscious. And then you sort of become, more and more conscious as the medicine clears from your system. I say it returns instantly, but that's, I guess if you think about it from the course of your whole life, it's just an instant. But in terms of the exact amount of time it takes, there is, maybe several minutes where all of a sudden, consciousness disappeared. And then your thoughts, you wake up and your thoughts continue. Your personality is still there. Your memories are still there, at least those from beforehand. And it really is as if someone just flipped a switch. But your brain remained alive. Most of the parts were going on as usual, but they weren't connected. And so you get this conscious experience that just suddenly disappeared as if it was turned off. So does that mean that consciousness was produced by the brain alone? Does the brain somehow enable a deeper aspect of ourselves to participate in this conscious experience? These are three possible models, but there are other ones I'm sure we could come up and think of. If you think about models, I've given them names. So you have the materialist model, and that means that it's just the brain alone. You have the integrated model, and that means that there's sort of a symbiosis between the brain and the spirit. And then I called something the avatar model from the movie Avatar. That is the main part of experience is the spirit, and it's really just the brain that is receiving consciousness from it. So in this case, in the materialist view, it's unnecessary, or they would even say it's non-existent. There is no such thing as a spirit. It's just your brain as a big machine, complicated machine creating consciousness. Both the brain and the spirit are necessary components. In this one, the integrated experience, they are both essential. And in this avatar experience, the brain is really just an interface through which the spirit interacts with the physical realm. I did talk about some of my experiences with general anesthesia, trying to count down and wake up as quickly as possible. But there was another time that I had to go under a light version of general anesthesia. I was getting these steroid shots in my back because I had some, chronic severe back pain. And this mild sedative was needed because as a patient, you still needed to cooperate with the medical staff. So you just weren't lying there unconscious. You had to, I remember actually that's what I'm getting to, but you have to stand up. You have to be able to respond to commands like turn around and relax and brace yourself. I don't know, whatever it is. So I had two of these procedures. The first one, I don't remember anything for. So even though it was a sedative, more mild sedative, it was as if it was a full general anesthesia. But the second one, afterwards, I had a memory of having to stand up and sort of bend over and get this painful shot in the lower, basically into your spine. It was definitely a foggy memory. I wouldn't really describe the memory as, fearful, or I couldn't remember like actual pain or having, like being in torment or anything like that. But it was nevertheless the last time I did it. And part of that was, I think, because, the steroids just weren't working and they didn't last very long. But I do think that even without perfect memory or recollection of this experience, there were other parts of my brain that were affected by the experience, and that led to negative feelings with unknown sources. I didn't know why I would have a negative feeling, but there was a negative feeling. And so it turns out that there are more than just short-term and long-term memory. There also is a memory and emotional conditioning that can occur through other pathways, lower parts of the brain, especially involving the amygdala, the basal ganglia, and certain subcortical loops. They don't require the same level of consciousness that comes through the hippocampus, but nevertheless, they still operate, they still work. And so the amygdala in particular, it can tag experiences with some sort of emotional valence, something like a threat or a pain or a vulnerability, even when the person has no conscious recollection of the event. We talked about some of these paranormal things, and now we're talking about some of these things that have to do with consciousness, like anesthesia, and you can also think of brain damage and comas. We talked about near-death experiences and past life memories, and then of course we have what we talked about the Bible describes about the spiritual reality. Which one of these models best encompasses these things? Which one fits the best? Or can you think of your own model that fits these different types of experiences and the truth or the hints or glimpses of what these things tell us better? than these three models that I have. So now another question you have to ask is, why would God create this kind of reality? And when I say this, I just mean this. What we all experience is the physical reality. So there's this idea of embodiment, and that is, one thing that AI and computers lack for the moment. There are people developing robots, and maybe some of them will even be for sale for a little bit. And that would be an example of an AI that actually has a body and can interact physically with the world. Otherwise, they're interacting through, a keyboard and through access to the internet and so forth. So why do we have to have this embodiment? And why do we have to have a physical life first? So if you think about the Christian standpoint, you have a physical life and then you have an afterlife. And there's a lot of religions that believe that. And so why does that physical part have to come first? And during that physical part, why does there have to be a mortality and a suffering, or you can think of the existence of evil? Why does that have to be part of the experience? And why does there have to be uncertainty instead of certainty about things like the spiritual realm, the afterlife, and God's existence? Why did God create it this way, where God is, I would say very confidently, I believe in God, but it's not because I saw him or he appeared in the sky, or there's the evidence of God for God is much more subtle. So why did God create things this way? Now, I put here cake or recipe. Would God bake a cake? Now, this is a really stupid question, but it's actually very interesting if you think about it. Some people just immediately will say, stupid question. God, given the chance, would just wish, or not wish is not the right word, but just, make a cake, baked cake, appear out of nowhere. Why would he wait around? Why would he mix up the batter and put it in an oven and wait around? He's got lots of things to do, right? So why would he do all that if the purpose was he was hungry and he wanted some cake to eat? He would just will a cake into existence, a baked cake, and he would just eat it already done, right? Wouldn't he do that? Then think about that and apply it to life. Wouldn't God just cut to the chase and create finished beings? Why would he do this physical life first if the physical life is pointing to, and the experiences therein are pointing to some changed, matured spirit? Why wouldn't he just cut to the chase and start with that matured spirit? Instead, what we see is that God creates processes of experience, this physical realm. And it seems as though character cannot simply be downloaded, that it has to be experienced, and that is what forges our character, or doesn't forge our character, depending on the type of life that you live. Now, you think about why shortcuts fail. I use that word shortcuts to, if you think about, if we were certain of an afterlife, why wouldn't we just end things and go there right now? Or why do we avoid taking risks that could end our lives? Is another way of saying it. Some people are happy jumping off a cliff with a parachute, or with a flying, suit and then a parachute, while other of us would never jump off the cliff. We would just sit there in fear, or we would never even appear on the cliff in the first place. Why would shortcuts not be acceptable? And I think the ideas have to do with real choices require real consequences. So there has to be some sort of consequence to making a mistake. If you jump off a rooftop, there has to be that you're going to hurt, and you might even break something, or you could even break your neck and die. And so that fear that you have before you do something risky, that is something that's real. And if you had the certainty of the afterlife, or if you had this idea of a reincarnation, or that you would have a do-over, that would certainly change your behavior. I think of the movie like Groundhog Day, where his behavior changed rapidly because he knew that no matter how the day ended, he would always wake up exactly the same at 6 in the morning with the same song playing, and then he could do something different with that day. If that's what we knew was reality, it really would change how you lived. So if you knew the ending, that would bypass this formation or formative experience. And so that is why shortcuts fail. And a lot of religions will even place certain, like rules like, if you end your life, then, you won't get the good afterlife. You'll go to the bad place instead of the good place or something like that. So what kind of beings or people, I put beings because I think this is true of all life. I don't know if all life have spirits or not. Who knows? That could be part of your model. But what kind of beings does this world produce? And I thought of things like courage despite the fear that you have, faith despite uncertainty, love despite suffering, and a building or a forging of character through sacrifice. Okay, the last slide, consciousness and the importance of history. I call history, or now that I was thinking about it for this episode, history is experiential technology. Or you can think of it as a borrowed experience of someone else or a past civilization. In a way, our lives are too short, even though we think we would agree that they're too short. We would like to live a little bit longer. But even for the experience that God wants us to live, our one life is too short for that. We have to learn and go off of some of the experiences from people that have come before us. So we inherit the experiences of other people and whole civilizations through oral traditions and through story books and so forth, videos. And there's a certain type of wisdom technology that accumulates across, or can accumulate across, generations. Now, why does this matter? Why does it matter that we have a starting point of where other people left off? I think if you think about how many times the word remember comes in Scripture, that we need to remember what has happened in the past and what our forefathers did and what the outcome of those actions did. And certainly there's this idea of forgetting history, you will repeat history, the failures of history, and that's unfortunate. That in and of itself is a lesson. You can look back in the past and say, those people didn't learn from the people before them, and so they had to repeat it again. If you think about books and teachers and AI or computers, they can help us preserve wisdom, but they can also manufacture a false history. They can have biases, and they might be thinking that they are preserving the best of their civilization while leaving out bad things. But we know that not to be true, because that would cause the next generation to not have that knowledge, the full knowledge of what the previous generations did. What does this mean for us? We simply cannot afford to ignore those who have come before us. And the Bible is a great place to start with. It may even be just enough, but certainly if you add to it learning things from previous wars or previous famines or previous genocides, how did those things happen? How can we avoid them? And we cannot afford, therefore, to stop teaching history, critical thinking. And it's really a warning to generations that do that. If they don't teach history, if they do not teach critical thinking, if that is not an important aspect of a civilization, that civilization will end. All right. Well, thanks again for joining me tonight. Perhaps one of God's greatest gifts isn't simply that we are conscious, but that we can learn from consciousness from those who came before us and also from the experiences of our own life. And I believe that's why Scripture exists in the first place. There's so much history, not even just in the history books, but in all the books about people, both godly and ungodly, and how their decisions and their actions led to one thing or another. So today we've tried to explore this really big topic. Next time, we will therefore continue talking about what consciousness is and what reality itself is, or spiritual realities, as the series is called. So remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends, and have a great evening.